Chains by Laurie Halse Part 1, Chapter 1. Monday, May 27th, 1776. Youth is the seed time of good habits, as well in nations as in individuals. Thomas Paine, Common Sense. The best time to talk to ghosts is just before the sun comes up. That's when they can hear us true, Mama said. That's when ghosts can hear us and answer us. The eastern sky was peach colored, but a handful of lazy stars still blinked in the west. It was almost time. May I run ahead, sir? I asked. Pastor Weeks sat at the front of his squeaky wagon with old Ben next to him, the mule's reins loose in his hands. The pine coffin that held Miss Mary Finch, wearing her best dress with her hair washed clean and combed, bounced in the back when the wagon wheels hit a rut. My sister Ruth sat next to the coffin. Ruth was too big to carry, plus the pastor knew about her peculiar manner of being, so it was the wagon for her and the road for me. Old Ben looked to the east and gave me a little nod. He knew a few things about ghosts, too. Pastor Weeks turned around to talk to Mr. Robert Finch, who rode his horse a few lengths behind the wagon. The child wants to run ahead, Pastor explained to him. She has kin buried there. Do you give leave for a quick visit? Mr. Robert's mouth tightened like a rope pulled taut. He had showed up a few weeks earlier to visit Miss Mary Finch, his aunt and only living relation. He looked around her tidy farm, listened to her ragged, wet cough, and moved in. Miss Mary wasn't even cold on her deathbed when he helped himself to the coins in her strong box. He hurried along to bury her, too, most improper. He didn't care that the neighbors would want to come around with cakes and platters of cold meat and drink ale to the memory of Miss Mary Finch of 2 Rhode Island. He had to get on with things, he said. I stole a look backwards. Mr. Robert Finch was filled up with trouble from his dirty boots to the brim of his scraggly hat. Please, sir, I said. Go then. He said, but don't tarry, I've much business today. I ran as fast as I could. I hurried past the stone fence that surrounded the white graveyard to the split rail fence that marked our ground and stopped outside the gate to pick a handful of chilly violets wet with dew. The morning mist twisted and hung low over the field. No ghosts yet, just ash trees and maples lined up in a mournful row. I entered. Mamma was buried in the back, her feet to the east, her head to the west. Some day I would pay the stone carver for a proper marker with her name on it. Dinah, wife of Cuff, mother of Isabel and Ruth. For now, there was a wooden cross and a gray rock the size of a dinner plate lying flat on the ground in front of her. We had buried her the year before, when the first roses bloomed. Smallpox is tricky, Miss Mary Finch said to me when Mamma died. There's no tellin' who it'll take. The pox had left Ruth and me with scars like tiny stars scattered on our skin. It took Mamma home to our Maker. I looked back at the road. Old Ben had slowed the mules to give me time. I knelt down and set the violets on the grave. It's here, Mamma, I whispered, the day you promised. But I need your help. Can you please cross back over for just a little bit? I stared without blinking at the mist, looking for the curve of her back or the silhouette of her head wrapped in a pretty kerchief. A small flock of robins swooped out of the maple trees. I don't have much time, I told the grass-covered grave. Where do you want us to go? What should we do? The mist swirled between tall grasses and the low-hanging branches. 2 black butterflies danced through a cloud of bugs and disappeared. Chickadees and barn swallows called overhead. Whoa! Old Ben stopped the wagon next to the open hole near the iron fence, then climbed down and walked to where Nehemiah the gravedigger was waiting. The 2 men reached for the coffin. Please, Mamma, I whispered urgently. I need your help. I squinted into the ash grove where the mist was heaviest. No ghosts. Nothing. I'd been making like this for near a year. No matter what I said, or where the sun and the moon and the stars hung, Mamma never answered. Maybe she was angry because I'd buried her wrong. I'd heard stories of old country burials with singers and dancers, but I wasn't sure what to do, so we just dug a hole and said a passel of prayers. Maybe Mamma's ghost was lost and wandering because I didn't send her home the right way. The men set Miss Mary's coffin on the ground. Mr. Robert got off his horse and said something I couldn't hear. Ruth stayed in the wagon, her bare feet curled up under her skirt and her thumb in her mouth. I reached in the pocket under my apron and took out the oat cake. It was in 2 pieces, with honey smeared between them. The smell made my stomach rumble, but I didn't dare nibble. I picked up a flat rock in front of the cross and set the offering in the hollow under it. Then I put the rock back and sat still. My eyes closed tight to keep the tears inside my head where they belonged. I could smell the honey that dripped in my hand, on the damp ground under me and the salt of the ocean. I could hear cows mooing in a far pasture and bees buzzing in a nearby clover patch. If she would just say my name just once. Girl! Mr. Robert shouted. There, you there, girl! I sniffed, opened my eyes, and wiped my face on my sleeve. The sun had popped up in the east like a cork and was burning through the morning mist. The ghosts had all gone to ground. I wouldn't see her today either. He grabbed my arm and pulled me roughly to my feet. I told you to move! Mr. Roberts snarled at me. Apologies, sir, I said, wincing with pain. He released me with a shove and pointed to the cemetery where they buried white people. Go pray for her that owns you, girl. Chapter 2. Monday, May 27th, 1776. I, young in life by seeming cruel fate, was snatched from Africa, fancied happy seat, that from a father seized his babe beloved, such my case, and can I then but pray others may never feel tyrannic sway. Phyllis Wheatley, to the Right Honorable William, Earl of Dartmouth. Amen, we said together. Pastor Weeks closed his Bible, and the funeral was over. Nehemiah drove his shovel into the ground and a mound of dirt and pitched some into the open grave. The earth rattled and bounced on the coffin lid. Old Ben put on his hat and walked towards the mule team. Mr. Robert reached for coins to pay the pastor. Ruth drew a line in the dust with her toe. My belly flipped with worry. I was breathing hard as I'd run all the way to the village and back. This was the moment we'd been waiting for, the one that Mama promised would come. It was up to me to take care of things, to find a place for us. I had to be bold. I stood up proper the way I had been taught, chin up, eyes down, took Ruth by the hand, and walked over to the men. Pardon me, Pastor Weeks, sir, I said. May I ask you something? He set his hat on his head. Certainly, Isabel. I held Ruth's hand tighter. Where do you think we should go? What do you mean, child? I know I'll find work, but I can't figure where to sleep, me and Ruth. I thought you might know a place. Mr. Weeks frowned. I don't understand what you're saying, Isabel. You're to return with Mr. Robert here. You and your sister belong to him now. I spoke slowly, saying the words I had practiced in my head since Miss Mary Finch took her last breath, the words that would change everything. Ruth and me are free, Pastor. Miss Finch freed us in her will. Mama, too, if she had lived. It was done up legal, on paper with wax seals. Mr. Roberts snorted. That's enough out of you, girl. Time for us to be on the road to Newport. Was there a will? Pastor Weeks asked him. She didn't need one. Mr. Roberts replied. I was Aunt Mary's only relative. I planted my feet firmly in the dirt and fought to keep my voice polite and proper. I saw the will, sir. After the lawyer wrote it, Miss Mary had me read it out loud on account of her eyes being bad. Slaves don't read, Mr. Roberts said. I should beat you for lying, girl. Pastor Weeks held up his hand. It's true. Your aunt had some odd notions. She taught the girl herself. I disapprove, of course. Only leads to trouble. I spoke up again. We're to be freed, sir. The lawyer, Mr. Cornell, he'll tell you. Ruth and me, we're going to get work and a place of our own to sleep. That's enough. Mr. Roberts narrowed his eyes at me. But, Mr. Cornell, I started. Shut your mouth, he snapped. The pastor cleared his throat. Perhaps we should inquire. Where is this Cornell? Mr. Robert demanded. Newport? He left for Boston before the blockade, the pastor said. Took his papers with him. The girl is lying, then, Mr. Roberts said. She knows the lawyer's absent, and her cause cannot be proved. The sooner I'm rid of her, the better. It's the truth, I blurted out. Ruth looked up at me anxiously and gripped my hand tighter. I said silence, Mr. Robert yelled. Isabel, remember your place. Pastor Weeks fumbled with the latch on his Bible. You and your sister belong to Mr. Robert now. He'll be a good master to you. My insides went cold, like I'd swallowed water straight from a deep, dark well. This couldn't be happening. Couldn't you send a message to Boston seeking Mr. Cornell? The matter is settled. Mr. Robert pulled on his gloves. If I might borrow your wagon and a man for driving to Newport, Pastor, I'd be grateful. These girls should bring a decent price at auction. You're selling us? The words flew out of my mouth before I could weigh them. Hush, Isabel, Pastor Weeks cautioned. The cold inside me snaked down to my feet and up around my neck. I shivered in the warm spring sunshine. Ruth bent down and picked up a shiny petal. What if we were split up? Who would take care of her? I fought back the tears. Pastor Weeks, please, sir. Mr. Robert knocked the dust from his hat. This should go quick. Your wagon will be back by nightfall. The minister placed the Bible in his leather satchel and pulled it up over his shoulder. He studied the ground, his hands, Mr. Robert's horse, and the clouds. He did not look at me. You'll be wanting to bring your shoes and blankets, he finally said. They'll fetch a better price that way. True enough. I'll have a word with Ben, explain matters. Pastor Weeks walked towards his own slave, keeping a hand on the satchel so it didn't bump against his side. My heart wanted to force my feet to run, but I couldn't feel them. Couldn't feel my hands, nor my arms, nor any part of myself. I had froze solid, sticking to the dirt. We were sold once before, back when Ruth was a tiny baby, not even baptized yet. They sold all of us from the plantation when old Mr. Malborn run up his debts too high. His bankers wanted their pounds of flesh, our flesh. One by one, they dragged us forward, and a man shouted our prices to the crowd like a likely buyer's, and baby Ruth cried, and Mama shook like the last leaf on a tree, and Papa, he didn't want them to bust up our family like they were sheep or hogs. I am a man, he shouted, and he was Mama's husband and our father, and baby Ruth, she cried, and I thought Mama would shatter like a bowl when it falls off a table. Papa fought like a lion when they came for him, the strongest lion, roaring. It took 5 of them with hickory clubs, and then Mama fainted, and I caught baby Ruth just in time, and there was lion's blood on the ground mixed with the dust like the very earth was bleeding. And we left there, we 3, in Miss Mary Finch's wagon, and everything in the whole world was frozen ice for nearly 2 years after that. I opened my mouth to roar, but not a sound escaped. I could not even mewl like a kitten.